Okay, so that's a good question. So if we're ranking the methods of taking body composition, and as far as what's going to be the most accurate, it's going to be effectively hydrostatic weighing in theory is going to be the most accurate, but the DEX is going to be very close to it. Air displacement plethysmography is going to be a bit behind, obviously both of those. BIS systems are going to be potentially better than handheld calipers, but BIA systems are going to be worse than most handheld calipers. That's what the book would recommend, which I think is a great diet for someone that's a long distance runner. But if you're dealing with someone that's not a long distance runner, I am not as big of a fan of that. I think the protein, if anything, is potentially too low, and a little bit too much concerns about the fat. Yeah, no worries. Well, when it comes to the hormones you need to know, that's all of them. So that doesn't really narrow down the list there. But let's go ahead and let's go ahead and get and have a nice little conversation about hormones. So give me one moment. I'm just pulling up the old lecture while we're talking. All right. So we have our hypothalamus and our pituitary gland that are pretty much, hypothalamus is the neurological system, pituitary gland is the master gland that's going to be pretty much controlling everything else that's coming after it as far as our hormonal function. Now, that's obviously going to influence releases of some of our stress hormones, going to be releasing our sex hormones, growth hormone in general, and affecting our thyroid hormone production. So let's go ahead, and since we have a number of you guys here, and we're thinking about the hormones in the human body, effectively, if we're going to go for the list of things you need to know, all the sex hormones, all the thyroid hormones, growth hormone, insulin-like growth factor, and other associated hormones, erythropoietin, aldosterone, antidiuretic hormone, angiotensin, and the other hormones related to your blood pressure control, and then our sympathetic nervous system hormones, epinephrine, norepinephrine, and then, yeah, the corticosteroids of cortisol. So, and you should probably also know your cytokines with like interleukin-6 and otherwise. But instead, let's go ahead and talk about the signaling pathways. So right now, we've got a grand total of 10 of you guys. So effectively, since I think the regulation there, Evan, is actually something that's very important to understand, we're going to go ahead and divide you guys up into 4 separate groups, okay? The first group is going to tell us effectively how our body is going to eventually get us to where we are producing thyroid hormones, okay? So we're really talking about T3 here. Group 2 is going to talk us about how we regulate our sex hormones, which is going to be both estrogen, estradiol, and testosterone. Group 3 is going to go ahead and tell us about how we regulate our cortisol response and how that's going to be produced. And then group 4 is going to go ahead and talk about our fluid dynamics, so that aldosterone and antidiuretic hormone. Does that make sense? So, one is going to be our Any questions there, guys? It is currently 1:37. I'm going to give you guys 5, 6 minutes. So plan on coming back about 1:43, 1:44, and we'll go ahead and talk through what you guys came up with. Are we ready to roll? I'm going to go with maybe. All right. Breakout rooms are open, guys. Whenever you're ready, go ahead and hop on in. Please go ahead and paste in what you guys came up with, or you can try and talk us through how these hormones are going to work. Okay, and then Holly, then the next component after that is TSH is then going to stimulate the thyroid gland to produce T4. T4 is then going to be converted into active levels of T3. And so we need those extra steps as well when it comes to maintaining thyroid production. Awesome. And then specifically that initial or that extra release of cortisol is going to be precipitated by essentially lower fuel availability levels in the body and a bit of a neurological stress response. Good. As well as obviously, Megan, that's going to be producing testosterone and estrogen appropriately as well in females. Okay, not bad, Jessica, but let's also think about antidiuretic hormone and how we're also going to be responding to sodium levels and fluid levels in the body as a means to increase or decrease essentially the loss of electrolytes, specifically sodium. Let's decrease its loss, but you can't really do anything to get rid of extra amounts of sodium. That's kind of the problem, the way the body's kind of rigged up there. You can get rid of excess potassium, and then obviously how fluid balances are going to influence those hydration hormones a bit more. Good. Now, obviously, we've got a little picture here of other things we need to keep in mind. We've touched on a number of these things. Obviously, a little bit more important for what we're talking about. Melatonin, if we're talking about sleep, our hormones related to our GI are going to be more about allowing us to obviously break down food appropriately. You guys are familiar with both insulin and glucagon and how that's going to be working to maintain appropriate levels of blood glucose for us as we're going through. Erythropoietin being the one that's going to signal for our bone marrow to increase our red blood cell production. And then, prolactin and relaxin, that's obviously far more important if you're pregnant and we're talking about having kids. Progesterone is another hormone that does interact as important along with estrogen for overall health. And our epinephrine and norepinephrine response to the sympathetic nervous system signaling. What else would you guys like to go ahead and review upon? What else would you guys like to talk about? Yeah, no worries. Give me one moment. All right, guys. So when we're talking about action potential, remember first we're going to have this action potential starting the brain. It's going to go down that motor neuron until it eventually gets to the axon terminal. Once it's there, these vesicles full of acetylcholine are going to release the acetylcholine into the neuromuscular junction, where it's going to go ahead, go across, and bind to the ligand-gated receptors. This in turn is going to allow for sodium to influx into the cell, which is going to bring that resting polarity up until we hit that threshold. When we hit the threshold, that's when the voltage gated channels are going to open and we have an action potential. So that action potential is going to then proliferate out of the neuromuscular junction, out of the synaptic cleft, down the sarcolemma and into the T tubules. When it gets to those T tubules, it's going to go through the GHP and ranitidine receptors, which in turn it's going to now, while it's in the sarcoplastic reticulum, the changing of those voltages allow for calcium to be released from the protein known as calsequestrin. That calcium is then going to go into the sarcoplasm, where it can now bind to troponin, which in turn is going to move tropomyosin off of the binding sites on actin, so that way myosin can grab hold of it. And in doing so, we're going to go ahead and have that contraction where we're going to pull the actin strands closer into the center. Now, the way that we're actually going to have this occur, as long as calcium is present, is initially we're going to have that binding that occurs between actin and myosin, and then effectively we're going to have ATP come in to get myosin to let go of actin. It's then going to hydrolyze, which is going to get that myosin to spring back into a cock position. It will then grab hold of myosin again and then pull itself forward immediately. And then when the next ATP comes in, it's going to relax, grab hold, and keep ratcheting its way up, pulling those actin strands closer together, as long as, once again, calcium is bound up to troponin and we have those binding sites being open. Now, once our cells go back to baseline, calcium is going to be pulled back, pumped back through the calcium ATPase pump on the sarcoplastic reticulum, which in turn is going to allow us to relax. What questions do you guys have? No other questions you guys want to go through? Yeah, no worries. Give me one moment. So when we're talking about the cardiovascular system, remember, guys, that it's effectively made up of uh, really three independent parts. The pump, which is your heart, the fluid, which is blood, and then the pipes, which is going to be your vasculature. And it turns out they're all pretty darn important. Yes. So all of these can change with training, okay? Now, the heart, the way it's going to change is mostly through that changes of that stroke volume. It's type 1 fiber, cardiac fiber is different than the other, it has its own blood supply. It's always going to take about 5% of the cardiac output. It is going to effectively cause itself to essentially contract through spontaneous rhythmicity, blah, blah, blah. Sympathetic tone is going to increase our heart rate. Vagal tone is going to decrease our heart rate. EKG is just that electrical component. There's some bad arrhythmias you don't want to have, blah, blah, blah. Okay. Wigger's diagram, remember, if you understand this, you understand how the heart works. But specifically, as we get to be more and more well-trained, we're going to have a greater stroke volume, which in turn is going to allow for us to pump more blood per beat. Now, we're also going to be increasing the amount of capillaries that are being recruited and the capillary number over a long enough period of time. So we're going to get better blood supply to the muscles of interest when we're actually doing the exercise, and specifically the fibers inside of them that are being used. So that's going to enhance our performance. Our blood is going to change with time, and that we're going to increase our plasma levels first, then we're going to increase our hematocrit, and that's going to typically only take about a month. Those stroke volume changes in the heart, that can be something that's going to take more or less like a full year of hard work and effort, and then something like our, with the capillarization, this is something that can also take years to fully manifest. What other questions you want me to talk about? So stroke volume, literally that's just how much blood pump per beat. End diastolic volume is how much blood is in the heart at the end of its relaxation. And stroke volume is how much blood is left over after it gets done contracting. We want this to obviously be a bigger number. Ejection fraction is then the percentage here of the stroke volume divided by that end diastolic volume. The higher your ejection fraction, the better job you're doing of getting blood out of your heart per beat, which is a good thing. Cardiac output is simply the number of times your heart is beating per minute multiplied by that stroke volume. So the greater the cardiac output, typically the greater the performance you're getting for that individual to go ahead and perform. And our resting cardiac output is usually around 5 liters. That's why I say the average. A little bit more if you're a bigger person, a little bit less if you're a smaller person. And then what we're really interested in is when you start exercising, that output is obviously going up because we're increasing stroke volume typically to about 60% of heart rate max, could be even higher than that. And then obviously our heart rate is going to increase until we get to max heart rate. And do remember that stroke volume actually becomes a little less, so a little bit lower when we get to maximal heart rate, simply because the heart doesn't have as much of a time to fill maximally with each beat. What other questions would you like me to review? It's the application of knowledge. So make sure you understand how we're going to get chronic changes in different systems in the body, and then also what type of adaptations we'd like to see. What systems would we like to see upgraded in different examples? Yeah, convection is going to be a fluid going over you. So this can be gas or liquids. Okay, conduction is physically touching it. So think like conducting electricity, you need to be touching that object in order to get the shot. Convection, think like as in ovens. So that way it's gonna be air convecting over you. Holly, my first question is, why does it matter? Because you get, I believe it's about 7 hours to write the entire thing out from when you click the start button. I think it's like, yeah, it might be like 14 or 15, somewhere in there. It's not a huge number of questions. They're just all short answer. Yeah. But you've got 7 hours. Let me go ahead and hit pause real fast. The final is effectively open book, open note. The key is you need to know how to apply your knowledge. It's not going to ask you, you know, what is the hormone that helps increase red blood cell production? Instead, you know, you just need to make sure that you're answering the questions fully. And so how long do I expect the answer to be? Most folks, if you can do it pretty succinctly in like bulleted points and sublists like that. And that's my favorite as far as it's really easy for me to grade because you just make your points real fast. You don't add a lot of fluff and a lot of how it makes you feel. I could care less about that. I just care about, do you show reasoning and you've thought through, and there are essentially the right answer or the best answers, but even if your answer is, incorrect, but you at least thought it through to a high degree, you're still going to get a pretty decent amount of extra credit or normal credit on that question for that matter. Yeah, it's usually, I don't know, I can answer each of them in about, at most, 4 to 5 sentences. But I wrote it, so it kind of gives me an unfair advantage. I'd say for most of you guys, the goal would be to, keep each of your answers as succinct as you can. And if you're not able to answer it efficiently, then you answer it as long as you need to. But make sure you're answering the question, not the question that you decide to make up on your own, but answering like what the question is. Because that's a problem that comes up, is people they kind of started to answer the question that they were given, and then they go off on this wild random tangent that has nothing to do with the question that I asked. It's like, okay, we've been on an adventure here. I've had to spend 10 minutes reading this, and it reminds me of the scene from Billy Madison, if you've seen it, when Billy Madison's trying to explain the Industrial Revolution. Yeah. What are the questions you guys want to talk about? Exactly, Evan. Exactly. It's as much fun for me as it was for that teacher and that. You use the valsalva maneuver as a means to help increase your stability through your core, specifically when doing maximal power movements or maximal strength movements. So it's the natural kind of bearing down against a closed glottis, aka you're contracting the muscles of your transverse abdominis and otherwise, and you're not letting your breath go out. So that's going to help you manage to keep more of an upright posture when you're under a heavy load. Yeah. Well, speaking of application, let's go ahead and we're going to do one more thing in small groups. So group 1, basics of how you program for strength. 2, this will be for power. Group 3 is going to be for hypertrophy. And then group 4, muscular endurance. So it's not long distance running, but it's going to be like doing sets of 10, doing sets of more than 10 repetitions. So how would you train for a maximal push-up test or otherwise? And I want you to think about using the information that we've talked about in the class and the application there. So the sets you're going to be doing. So sets and reps, you will be performing along with relatively tight percentage ranges you want them to work within. Good question. So before we send you into these groups to talk about this, let me paste that in, which is effectively best way to study for this. Well, I've been giving you guys examples of how to think this through and apply it as we've gone through these lectures throughout the semester. So how do we actually, how do we apply this? What does this mean? How are we doing it? So there's examples in every single lecture that are literally pretty tightly based upon the exact same questions you're going to get on the final. So I would say when it comes to a study guide, I would, you can always go through the old lectures, go through your notes, go through things that we are doing like we're about to do in a moment, where we're going to go ahead and put you guys into separate groups. So you guys have to think about different components, because obviously on the final, you're in charge of doing all that on your own. I would also say there's the homework study guides for each chapter. So if you don't think you really understood the key points of each chapter, I would go through and look at those individually, not the homework quizzes, separate deal, but look at the study guides for each chapter that I have on there for the ones that you think you don't fully understand. And then while you're looking at all those questions, ask, how do I apply this knowledge? How is this, what would this knowledge be useful for other than going on a game show? And that's going to help you guys kind of light the way. And then, like I said, you can always keep asking for application questions whenever we come in and review, since we're going to be reviewing for effectively 3 more sessions, unless you guys want to call it a day earlier, but I don't think that's fair to you guys. And as much as I don't, excuse me, like talking to myself in a room for an hour, I still want to make sure you guys are getting something out of it. So, Holly, does that answer your question? Awesome. So whenever you guys are ready, go ahead and hop in those rooms. Give you guys another 6-7 minutes to think it through. And I am be specific. If you're trying to build strength, we're only doing this many reps per set, this many sets in a training session, this percentage of our max, and so on. Okay, because we're going to talk through it, because there's going to be some wild things that are going to come up there. And this is an important thing to understand when it comes to the application of knowledge. So see you guys back at 2:11, 2:12. All right, guys, when you're ready, go ahead and post into the chat what you guys came up with. Okay, so hypertrophy group, that's not bad. You probably actually would be interested in maybe doing a few more sets. And then as far as percentages, you could probably also bring that down as low as 60%. In fact, there's even research showing you can go even lower than that. The problem with using loads over 80%, it's hard to do that many repetitions, so it can be more difficult. Not bad for the muscular endurance, and you might even want to go higher than 15 repetitions. And once again, percentage you can sync that a little bit lower, much higher. You're not gonna be able to do as many reps. But for both, but for the muscular endurance, you also probably want to work on decreasing your rest periods as well, since I don't see that being brought up. For the strength training, no, you want to keep your reps typically around probably more to the 3 to 5 rep range. And yes, you can build it over 60%. You probably want to stick more between 70 to 85. Once you're going over much over 90%, it's just hard to get in a lot of volume. That is a methodology you just got to be careful of because there's a lot of stress on the body in doing so. And then whenever you guys are ready, where is my power training group? Okay. For power output, you want to do super low rep sets. So we're usually talking sets of 1 to maybe 5 repetitions. Definitely using a lot more sets. And then, yeah, it can be as low as it could be 10 to 20% of the max, all the way up to 100. Power is all about intent and specifically staying low on the repetition. So, any other questions today of anything you guys would like me to go ahead and talk about? Otherwise, we'll call it today on the review here, and we will obviously take over again, talking more about different aspects of exercise physiology that you guys have questions on. So come ready with questions on Wednesday, and then once again, be ready for the wonderful lab we've got on Friday. Questions, comments, concerns. Occlusion's brutal. I'm going to try to put a video up relatively soon of me suffering so you can get an idea of how to do it. It's awful. Anything, guys? Well, awesome. I guess on that note, you guys stay safe out there, and I will chat with you guys more soon. So have a great day, be safe, and see you guys on Wednesday. Come ready with questions.